Hello, folks trickling in. We, of course, won't start until probably 2 minutes past the hour. So if you need a bio break, please do take one. Panelists, just for a fun icebreaker, today in the DCN Data Curation Network's governance board meeting, we were talking about favorite mascots, either for your high school or your university, or like one of the hometowns of my parents has a mascot. What is your favorite mascot? It's a good question, right? Or maybe your least favorite?
I maybe don't have a favorite, but I used to go to the Lynx basketball games, and sometimes they would have various mascots. And during the halftime, they'd try to play basketball, and it was pretty funny.
So I'm not a sports person, so I don't really do mascots. But what I will say is I'm fond of Gritty because what I really do well is the internet, and I like memes. And Gritty is in a lot of really good memes.
Oh, there are a lot of good memes. Yeah, Gritty got a lot of love today in the governance, and a lot of what is this? There was no in between of huh. It was either, yeah, anyways.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm a U of M alum, so I should say the Gopher. But I also love Uga, the bulldog who always makes an appearance at UGA events. So, yeah, go Uga as well. And basically anyone that has a dog mascot, I'm a fan of.
Yeah, I'm a UMD, University of Minnesota Duluth, and they have bulldogs, but I like the bulldogs on ice skates. They come out for various sports, but since hockey's a big sport in northern Minnesota, mascots on ice skates.
Sandy, did you have one? We didn't hear today in governance board.
So, I'm also not a big sports person, but I do think that the best part of going to a Chicago Bulls game is Benny the Bull and his acrobatics, because he does these all kinds of crazy flips and uses a trampoline to vault himself all over the court. Yeah, he's pretty fantastic.
That is awesome. All right. Well, I have noticed our participant number has kind of steadied off. So I'm going to pause for a minute and then introduce our speakers. And this is just to facilitate my trimming the recording when I need to edit it. So when I pause for an awkwardly long time, that's why, attendees. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for a webinar discussion about curating historical scientific analog data. My name is Michaela Narlock, and I am the director of the Data Curation Network based at the University of Minnesota, which is how I got to know some of these phenomenal speakers that you are going to hear from in a minute. I am going to let them introduce themselves because they know themselves best. But if you have any questions or comments throughout this, please feel free to shoot me a direct message in the chat. You can also use the Q&A feature. A fair word of warning, we don't use the webinar format in Zoom as often, so I do appreciate in advance your patience as we, work through the different technical challenges that webinar format proposes. And with that, I will turn it over to our amazing speakers. Oh, and I wanted to note, we will have time for a Q&A and discussion at the end, and that will be facilitated by the phenomenal Sandy Calderon, but we'll get there in a minute. So Shannon, I believe I turn it over to you. Take it away.
So I'm not the one who's going to be doing the first slides, but I will introduce myself first. So I'm Shannon Farrell. I am at the University of Minnesota. I'm the Research Data Services Lead and the director of our data repository, which is known as DRUM. I am a member of the DCN. I'm the only person on our group here who is a member of the DCN. So, because I am a data curator at the University of Minnesota as well. And I guess I'm just going to go down the line here. So Lois.
Hi, Lois Hendrickson. I am a rare books curator of a collection that is the history of medicine and biological sciences. So thinking about historic data back to the 15th century.
Hi, everyone, and I'm Kristen Mastel. I'm the librarian out at Anderson Horticultural Library, which is our arboretum about 40 minutes outside of the Twin Cities campus. And Julie.
Oh, I'm Julie Kelly, and I'm just about to retire for the second time as a science librarian at the University of Minnesota. But I'm going to still work on the analog data project. And I think I'm starting out. So we're going to talk today about curating historical scientific analog data. We're going to talk mostly about some of the activities we've undergone or we've taken upon ourselves at the University of Minnesota. We got started in this project, oh my goodness, 6 or 8 years ago. A couple of things happened. A department chair called us and said, one of our graduate students who's now in his 70s has all kinds of information about his mountain plover research, notebooks, videos, drawings, all this. Could you find a place for it? And we said, we'll try. And we also inherited from the Department of Horticulture 100 years worth of potato breeding records. And again, they wanted us to keep them. They knew they were valuable, wanted us to keep them safe. And we at this point didn't really know what to do. Some of us had some science background, and so we knew that these sort of things were out there in the world. We didn't know if they should go to the archives, to our institutional repository, if they were safe staying in the departments where they were, or there were other options. So that we started on this journey. Next slide. What we've done so far in this is we did a survey and some interviews of the staff and faculty at the university to find out what data they had, what they thought about it, just to get a handle. We did a lit review to see if anybody else had been interested in this topic over the years and found, yes, of course they had. We took on some small data related projects, one with a horticultural research center, mostly with apple and other fruit breeding data. We investigated in the university archives to see if we could find data, and we did some work with the Itasca Biological Station, looking for data and gathering and sort of organizing that. And we just have recently started collaborating with other institutions that are doing work on analog projects to see where our commonalities are, where we, what we've been working on, how we might all move forward together. Next slide. So the survey and the interviews, we wanted to know, as I mentioned, how much was out there and what researchers were doing, what they were thinking. We had this terrible feeling that there were going to be people that would be retiring soon, and maybe we're going to be taking data with them. So we wanted to nab them right away. So we got about 100 respondents, and then we asked them if we could chat more with them, and 17 said yes. And so we had a little more in-depth interviews with those folks. Next slide. Found some interesting things. Not surprisingly, there is a lot of data out there. It's in labs, it's in offices, it's in basements, it's in attics, it's in the trunk of people's cars. It's just all over the place. People are still using that data. They're still adding to it, although oftentimes they're adding to a long range set of data, but they may collect in analog format, but most often the things they use now, they're turning into electronic format in short order, but not going backwards. Most of it hadn't been scanned or made machine readable. Very little of it had. People really didn't know what was going to happen to the data when they left, and they were worried about it. Most of it came with written documentation, and also there was usually a person that could have provided that sort of information too. And most people wanted to share their data, were happy to. Many of them already had shared it. So that was kind of interesting as well. Next slide. We also did a project in our university archives. We wondered, number one, was there data there? Number two, was it findable? Was it usable? How much was there? How old was it? We did a very sort of quick and dirty look at it. We went in just searching for data, searching for we limited to life sciences and agriculture. Why don't we go to the next slide? And we just tried to get a handle on, we selected collections that we suspected had data just to see what we could find. And only 22% had a description of the methods that was even reasonable. We knew we could get a little higher than that if we followed the trail back to any publications that had been associated with that data, but that proved to be pretty time consuming. Although 46% was usable in some fashion, even if we couldn't repeat the project or carry it on. It was an interesting list of what species were spotted in this certain location at this year. So more of it was usable than that. The work was very labor intensive, which we kind of knew was going to happen, but it was even more so than we thought. One thing that we did very carefully was we wanted to figure out if it would be possible to find more data searching in the archives in the finding aids. So we noted every single term that was even remotely related to data that we might be able to go back and use. And we found 75 terms, and none of them were used very often, lots and lots of different ones. So that was kind of a bummer. And findability is a challenge that even after doing this project, we really don't see any clear answer to yet. We're still working on it. Next slide.
Yeah, so another project we did was with our Horticultural Research Center, where we really looked at apple data. So one of our researchers, Dr. Luby, mentioned that there was a lot of data out at the Arboretum where this apple project is housed, and that it was poorly organized, which was really an understatement. And so we offered to help. So we took a field trip out to their vault. What do they have? What does it look like? It turns out it was a small room, floor to ceiling shelves, 10 feet high, covered in data. And you can see some of the examples of notebooks that the data was living in. It was data related to breeding, accessions, scion wood data, experimental data, maps, and the vast majority was original data, and some of it was proprietary. Some was organized, but it wasn't labeled. And overall, the researchers didn't know what was in each notebook or binder. Not to mention that it was dirty. There was some garbage in there that could be thrown out. So what did we do? To help them get a grasp of what existed in the vault, we used these skills that we have and you have to process and organize things. We worked in conjunction with the researchers to create a detailed inventory that included a data dictionary, which you can see on the lower right-hand part of the slide. The researchers identified the terms and keywords that they wanted to use when they searched the data. They thought they would use terms like field observations, field maps, breeding material. And we wanted to include information about the data's physical location and format and what it looked like on the shelf. This took several all-day site visits to complete. The next part of our work involved digitizing a portion of their data. And one of the things we asked them in this inventory process was, what was their priority for digitizing the data based on what they thought was most important, what was at risk for loss, and what could be made available publicly. We were able to do some of this work with an internal University of Minnesota grant and continue to work to digitize some of their next priorities in order, with the goal being to make this data publicly available and working with the breeders to make sure that the way it's organized and described is adequate for other researchers to use. The data you can see then is not machine readable when digitized. The vast majority was handwritten. Now, the physical items probably are appropriate for the archives, but they, at this time, are not going to be deposited there because the Horticultural Research Center is 30 miles away from the main campus, and the data is actively being used by researchers. Just as a note, one of the reasons that this was a really significant institutional project is that one of these apples, the Honeycrisp, has generated over $6 million for the university by 2007 when it lost its domestic patent protection. Next slide, please. And you can see here in our records what, once it was digitized, how this is organized for discovery and accessibility and use. Next slide. As Julie mentioned, we also did a literature review in which we wanted to think about how scientific researchers are dealing with this data, and are there any large-scale efforts that have happened? So in our analysis, we looked at a subset of 66 scientific papers that used analog data, and only 7 of these 66 papers in our subset told about how the authors had located this data, and none of the authors in this set of papers mentioned that they had gone back to the original authors of the publications to obtain more detailed information about the data. So there's quite a lot of picking through this data to understand how is historic analog data being utilized. So we know that researchers use older data in a variety of ways. They repeat earlier surveys or experiments. They incorporate portions into current work. It helps them develop plans for research. Some large data collections like iDigBio provide background, training examples, and other resources. And so authors are more likely to mention or cite these collections, but this is not true for the projects that used this older data. Some of the challenges we discovered in this lit review of reusing older data were that there's very few standards or best practices. Reformatting and preservation of analog data costs are high. As you probably noticed in our Apple project, there's a lot of time-intensive labor involved. Some of the problems with older data include difficulty locating it, and that the historical records may have biases. Next slide. So overall, we looked at 50 years of literature on this topic, and no surprise, found that researchers valued this data and they're concerned about its loss, but that there was no clear path found. And most efforts really have concentrated on a specific discipline or a narrow field of study. Some of the efforts to identify and preserve this data have focused on digitizing or rekeying it, and the data held by individual researchers is the most difficult to discover and most at risk. This is true for almost everything except perhaps the CODATA at-risk task group and its successor, the Research Data Alliance's Data Rescue, which has done some work on this. And in general, on a large scale, some of this work would be prohibitively expensive, and not everyone agrees that an approach of just in case someone needs this data is the best approach. Next slide. So as Julie mentioned again at the beginning, after some of these studies and the SLIT review, we started to collaborate with people across the United States who are also working on analog, historic analog data in their various disciplines or institutions to figure out where are the commonalities, what solutions have people encountered, how are they doing this? And two things that have emerged, or several things that have emerged from this collaboration, is that what is critical is the involvement of scientists, their knowledge, plus the embedding of data managers, and which relieves scientists of responsibility. Really, that historical data is an institutional asset, and you can leverage that asset. And that finding solutions requires collaboration across institutions.
Okay, so now I'm up. So the title of our talk was about curating data. And so we really want to focus here on what makes analog data curation different. So first of all, I think we have found that making analog data, historical analog data, fair, following the FAIR principles, is super difficult. And that wasn't true just for us. Like we mentioned, when we've been talking with other people who are working on similar projects, they found that as well. Although it guided all of our projects, putting it into practice is very difficult. So for instance, as you saw throughout all of the projects that we just discussed, not all of our data could be made interoperable. We didn't even make all of our data machine readable. The majority of the stuff that we have done, the projects that we have worked on, have been just scanned, if we made it digital at all. Many of the folks that we've talked to in their projects attempted to make their data very well defined and tidy. So meaning they're configured in such a way that they can be accessed by machine. So I guess what I want to say here is that with regards to FAIR, we really were just trying to do the best that we could when working with analog data, and it's not necessarily going to reach that same threshold that digital data does. And so the second bullet here says it requires a high level of input from the data producer. Now, I know all of us as curators have seen really messy data sets that have been submitted that you don't know what the files are, and it's sort of a mess looking at it. But with analog data, it seems to be sometimes on a whole other level. We made a site visit out to a research center on campus, and we're confronted with gosh, Lois, how many was it? I mean, it was file cabinets upon file cabinets full of folders. Can you remember how many they were? I mean, it was.
Yeah, I think there were 4-drawer file cabinets, and there was at least 20 to 28 of them.
Right, filled with data, and they weren't organized, they weren't labeled. And so what that requires is that someone is able to at least tell you what they might be about. I mean, looking at these sheets, you're not necessarily going to know what they are, let alone how they could be described and organized. So yeah. What year is it from? Who produced it? When did it happen? What species were they looking at? Like, sometimes none of that is clear. So the person who produced these data sets might not even be around, and you're talking to their successor. So it really does require a larger scale collaboration, I would say, in trying to figure out how you are going to curate this data. The next thing that we wanted to talk about is motivation. So as we all know, there's all sorts of federal mandates and journal mandates in place around data sharing and making data management. That is not true with these historical analog data sets. So the motivation to rescue them seems to be lower. And in fact, when we talked to some researchers in our survey and in the interview project that we did, a lot of them said, no one's going to care about this anyway. And in many cases, I would disagree. But I can understand that their motivation, they know that this is a very time-consuming project. They don't have the time to do that. They are actively chasing after other grants. And there is no real glaring impetus to get them to work on a project like this. And finally, there's no universal solution of how or where to preserve this data, or how to make it discoverable and accessible unless we turn it digital, right? So there's no known indexes or repositories. With digital data, we have a whole host of repositories that folks can put their data in. But what about this stuff that isn't digital? Or what about the stuff that isn't machine readable? Where does it go? And so that's sort of the big question, and something that we still are working on. The successful projects that both we and our collaborators have worked with are not just random data. It was data that we carefully selected for preservation. So things that we thought other folks would really care about, or things that were famous. I mean, the Honeycrisp, you can't get more famous for the U of M in that case. So that was a very easy thing to start with. But these projects, saying that, these projects also took a lot of effort with very little built-in support. So next slide. Excuse me. So all that being said, we really do want to look to you, our network in the digital curation network and fellow curators. So how can you help in these efforts? So we need to put structures in place for researchers to discover and reuse these historical data sets. What those are, we don't know yet, but it would be a great conversation and research project. It would also help if we were able to adopt and promote metadata and citation standards for historical data sets. We haven't seen any that are in place yet. We're sort of making do with following analogous structures with digital data sets, but there are other confounding factors here, of course. We need to find solutions for data that's been scanned, like I've said a million times now, maybe of handwriting, something similar, not just machine readable data. We already know what to do with machine readable data, but not with that other stuff. We need to consider how we can make data that remains in analog format findable and discoverable. So, you know, as a unit here, and as we've told other folks, like we know that the Horticultural Research Center has all of their data out there in analog format, but it's not discoverable or accessible by anyone else other than the researchers there. And then the final one is we should consider creating templates that would help researchers manage their analog data better. And this also includes specimens. That's a question that we've been getting lately from folks who are collecting things out in the field. There's no real guidelines for how to manage or store those as well. So just sort of something that falls alongside this. Next slide. So this is just another ask. That's sort of it for us. It's about a half hour here. So to wrap up, we really do want to hear from you. I have seen some really interesting discussion happening in the chat that I haven't been able to respond to, but if this is happening at your institution, or you are working on projects, or you know of potential projects where historical data sets could be rescued or were rescued, we would love to hear about it. We also would like to know what's most at risk at your institution, what should be saved, and so on. So let's talk about it. We can talk about it now, or feel free to drop us a note. I have copied all of our email addresses here. And then the last slide is just some of the work that we've done. So we will be sharing these slides. Kristen, if you want to advance to that one maybe, and then come back just to show them. Yeah, so this is just a list of our work that we've done, and we'll go back to the other slide so you can write down our email.